Most historians believe that the Wild West died in the early 20th century, and state-on-state conflicts are a thing of the early years after the Revolution. But those who've been out west say the exact opposite, as state-on-state conflicts and internal conflicts raged well into the 1990s, with some areas still being contested until 2026. This is the first of many stories to come from the United States' western expanses. The Ranchers' War. It's been 12 days since those parky bastards burned Alton to embers, leaving no man or child in their wake in the process. We finally caught their northern force along the Duchesne River near the town of Mitten, initiating our assaults in the early hours of the 24th under the cover of a rain squall. The enemy wasn't our more pressing problem, it was the mud. I saw an M113 get swallowed whole by the swollen Duchesne, and seen the crew nearly drown in mud as they tried to escape. It slowed our progress against them. But we did not falter and pushed past our limits, making a breakthrough near their center positions, putting them to rout, to which they would keep until leaving the county altogether. I personally seen it to the deaths of 3 men by my hands in the battle. Not since the war in Nam have I taken a life with an M16, but here at home in tranquil Utah I have done so again, against an enemy that sees to it our destruction, much to such a degree where the church has sent out a call for arms. I have seen veterans of the old wars march in columns of 2 as a response to this call. Mormon Brigade, we have come to call them, fought alongside us during the campaign. I'd say if it weren't for their tenacity of those old bloods, we might not have seen our success in our mud-laden escapade. I fear for the future of this conflict, of its scale, escalating past that of Utah into more populous-dense areas of neighboring states. I fear this state will be locked in perpetual torment, making our ancestors trek into this Holy Land a useless endeavor. I fear for the blood that runs in my veins and those of my descendants being split further on the squabbles of those who can't see reason. My one and only hope is the quick end to this terrible setting. But I see these men will not be put down until the whole lot of them are hanging in the prison yards of Salt Lake. Ulysses Herbert Bletchen, son of one of the most infamous families of the region, the Bletchen family. He wrote that in a journal around 1983. The White Stag and the ranching families of Utah have had a bitter rivalry since the Western White Stag Militia chapter was formed during the Second Mormon Split of 1890, caused by the outlawing of polygamy, after which radical members of Brigham Young Security Detail would rally similar thinking members of the church and form an exodus, burning and pillaging as they made their way down south out of the Salt Lake Valley, fading into the expansive landscape of central and southern Utah. Over time, their influence would spread into Colorado and the Strip of Arizona, which in turn brought them into conflict with the ranching families, whose property was being raided, and eventually the state itself in 1972. The ranchers and militia fought many skirmishes before this, though, with the most infamous being the Battle of Taliona, which was part of the bigger Duchesne Bush War, an attempt by the White Stags of pushing the pro-state militias out of the county. Ranchers funneling money, arms, and advisors to the pro-Salt Lake militias, running the county into a stalemate. God, that was a fucking sentence. As the first White Stag War against the state ended toward the tail end of 1973, the families met in Roosevelt at a cattle auction farm and sent a written pledge to Salt Lake, threatening to enact a full-on conflict with the militia if the ceasefire didn't see a complete demilitarization of the militia. The Utah government followed through reinforcing the ceasefire until 1982, until outside pressure from the federal government forced the Guard to withdraw, after California tourists were harassed by the Guard after they entered a restricted area, and CNN got hold of the story, completely negating the reason why they were deployed in the first place. The White Stags then continued their skirmishes after the Guard withdrew from their land, burning and pillaging farms and small towns for resources. An estimated $500,000 worth of cattle disappeared into White Stag territory. When the pleas of the ranchers went unheard, they met back up in Roosevelt and fulfilled their threats, and declared war on the militia, sending a copy of the declaration to nearby radio stations to be read out across the state. The ranchers sent a call to the Draper militia, who happily responded, as many of the families' sons fought in Vietnam, and the militia, being mostly veterans, were glad to help their brothers in arms, along with previous grudges left unresolved. 1983 would see the first opening shots of the war when the White Stags torched the small town of Alton in Kane County, which was in White Stag territory, but most of the territory the militia controls is rural, choosing to avoid cities and towns and areas controlled by local law enforcement and state actors. Alton was a town of 75 people and a pro-Salt Lake stronghold, which made it a potential staging point for any force coming out of Utah-controlled White Washington County. So the White Stags sent in a force to take over the town to prevent movement into the less defended southern region. The force sent to Alton did not care for the civilians, and when faced with pistol fire from the local sheriff, the militia burnt the town down, sparing no one, including children, pushing the remains into a mass grave. Only 15 people survived and made it to the county capital of Kanab to inform the people of what happened. The burning of Alton enrages the citizens of Utah, who lobby Salt Lake to do something, but before a response could be announced, the Salt Lake Valley experienced a massive, devastating flood, destroying the region and diverting all attention as phone lines went dead. The Guard couldn't act, but the citizens will. Veterans from all over the state, including active National Guard, flooded into the ranks of the Draper militia, who have long since rebranded to the Ranchers Militia, and counterattacked the White Stags along the Duchesne River outside Roosevelt. The combat was intense, as Ranchers APCs and a singular Pershing battle tank, which is wholly outdated at this time, encountered heavy mortar fire and accurate rounds from a Bofors anti-aircraft gun. Heavy armaments these militias are packing now, back in the past. Nowadays it's just a technical with a douche gun. But back in the day it was... holy hell, it was something else. The rainy season would also bog them down, engulfing entire vehicles in drowning mud as they tried to cross the Duchesne. Only when the sky cleared would they break through the White Stags' main defensive line and eventually push them outside the county entirely, diminishing the control of the White Stags significantly in the northern portion of Utah. The years dragged on into 1985 with little major engagements as the White Stags moved to guerrilla warfare, and the lack of aerial assets made advancing into central Utah a great risk to the Ranchers militia and their sparse armored elements. Thus, the war evolved into a standstill, even with some National Guard units mobilizing at the beginning of 1984. The hesitancy to deploy them in non-support roles curtailed the usefulness, acting as glorified peacekeepers behind the main line. If you thought the UN was useless, the Utah National Guard during this period was even more so. This is what happens when you tie your hands behind your back and expect things to go well. I'm directly calling you out, UN. You are a useless organization and need to be disbanded. Where the fuck was I? It wasn't until the attempted assassination of Utah Senator Brigham Ulema as he was stabbed trying to enter the Utah Capitol building by White Stag radicals, who were then decapitated by the shotgun of Ulema's bodyguard. This is when the Rancher War would end and the Second Utah White Stag War would begin in earnest as full mobilization of ground, air, and river naval assets, that's a mouthful, would begin. The National Guard would commence their operations with the first airstrikes being conducted by two B-24 Liberators and a squadron of F-4 Phantoms on a major vehicle depot in Carbon County outside the former town of Castle Gate. An estimated 20 vehicles were destroyed, including two M4 Shermans, two half-tracks, and one Soviet-supplied PT-76. These losses would force the militia to abandon the county entirely, as most of their armored support was engulfed in napalm and cluster munitions. Salt Lake would order the ranching families to stand down to avoid unwanted conflict when the Guard began the ground offensive. They will comply, thus officially ending the ranching war, as the Second Utah White Stag War would encompass and absorb it. Further investigation conducted after the Second Utah White Stag War in 1987 in the now liberated Carbon County would reveal Soviet involvement in the conflict, as shipping crates labeled as drainage pipes from Mexico revealed hordes of Soviet weaponry, including another disassembled PT-76. After a decade of information gathering, a list of involved parties in the Ranchers' War was compiled and filed away into the archives of Utah's FBI field office. But that happened decades ago, and has since been released. Some of the notable and crazy factions were the Ranchers Militia, the Western White Stag Militia chapter, and you heard me right, there is an Eastern chapter, and they are a much more better party to communicate with and have fight alongside you. Don't ask me how I know that. The Colt of David, which was a White Stag ally, the Utah National Guard, CIA, FBI, KGB, the Hatch Minutemen, a rancher ally, and many Ute and Navajo militias who sided with the ranchers, as the White Stags treated them much worse than the landowners, if you could believe that. The Navajo Legion out of Beaver City, on the ranchers' side, and the Ku Klux Klan of Arizona, who gave heavy support to the White Stags. Just basically, if you can name a faction, I can tell you they were probably involved. The White Stags would degrade over the next couple decades until culminating in the Third White Stag War in 2012, but that's a different story for another time.